Thomas Bradley froze in the meticulously manicured garden of his massive estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, when he saw Rachel kneeling on the lush green grass. She was blowing delicate soap bubbles into the mild afternoon breeze, while his twin boys smiled and giggled for the very first time in 8 agonizing months. Thomas felt his legs go completely weak, unable to take a single step forward from his spot near the stone pathway. Rachel had not even noticed his presence yet, completely absorbed in entertaining the children, murmuring a soft rhythmic melody that he could barely hear. The twins, Peter and Michael, looked entirely different. It was not just the smiles, but their relaxed posture, the bright gleam in their eyes, and the energetic way they reached for the shimmering spheres. Swallowing the heavy lump in his throat, Thomas took 2 cautious steps forward, accidentally stepping on a dry oak branch that snapped with a loud crack. Rachel snapped her head around immediately, her eyes widening in sheer panic as she gripped the small plastic bottle of bubble solution tightly in her hand. She scrambled to stand up hastily, wiping her soapy hands on her plain gray uniform while stammering a rushed apology about not knowing he was home. Thomas quickly raised his hand, his voice trembling with a raw, overwhelming emotion he had almost forgotten how to feel, and pleaded with her to please stay exactly where she was. Rachel remained frozen on her knees in the soft grass, looking profoundly confused and bracing herself for a harsh reprimand from the wealthy homeowner. Instead, Thomas choked back a sob and whispered that his boys were actually smiling, his voice breaking entirely as he repeated the miraculous observation to the bewildered housekeeper. She glanced from the laughing toddlers back to her employer, genuinely failing to grasp the monumental weight of his tearful realization, and simply explained that she had brought the toys from her own neighborhood. Thomas shook his head vigorously, interrupting her explanation to reveal the painful truth that his children had not smiled or shown a single ounce of joy for over 8 long months. Rachel blinked slowly, her mind struggling to process the devastating reality of his words as Thomas cautiously bridged the gap between them like he was approaching a fragile glass sculpture. He stopped 3 yards away from her and crouched down to eye level with his infant sons, overwhelmed, when little Peter turned his joyful face toward him. Whispering a tender greeting to his boy, Thomas extended a shaking hand, and Peter took a clumsy step forward to wrap his chubby fingers tightly around his father's index finger. Michael eagerly followed his brother's lead, grabbing Thomas's other hand, causing the desperate father to squeeze his eyes shut, as a tidal wave of suppressed tears finally broke free. Watching the heartbreaking scene unfold, Rachel remained perfectly still, completely unsure of what protocol dictated when a millionaire employer broke down weeping in the middle of his extravagant garden. She softly apologized again, assuming she had inadvertently crossed a professional boundary, but Thomas sharply cut her off, wiping his wet cheeks and looking directly into her empathetic eyes. He confessed that she had effortlessly accomplished in an hour what he had miserably failed to do while spending millions of dollars on 43 different elite medical specialists. He detailed the agonizing trips to exclusive clinics in Boston, New York, Miami, and London, paying for experimental treatments that cost more than she would ever earn in a decade. His voice cracking under the weight of his profound exhaustion, Thomas explained that he had hired 24-hour nursing staff and purchased imported medications, yet absolutely nothing had worked. The distinguished doctors had offered endless conflicting diagnoses, blaming everything from severe colic and atypical development to rare allergies, leaving his family in a constant state of agonizing despair. He revealed the darkest truth of his current life. The relentless stress had triggered a severe nervous breakdown for his beloved wife Sarah, who had been resting in a private psychiatric facility for the past 2 months. Left entirely alone to raise 2 eternally crying infants in a cold, empty mansion, he had been paying absolute fortunes to renowned experts who could not provide a single effective answer. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Thomas marveled aloud at how he had hired Rachel merely 3 weeks ago to scrub his hardwood floors. Yet, she had magically cured his family's misery. Feeling her heart race with sudden anxiety, Rachel humbly insisted that she had merely played with them, swearing she had not administered any strange remedies or broken any rules. Thomas gently demanded to know every single detail of her interactions with his sons, desperate to understand the secret behind the miraculous transformation that had brought peace to his sprawling estate. Hesitantly, Rachel explained how on her first day she had heard the boys screaming, while a strict private nurse aggressively tried to force-feed them expensive formula. Rachel described how she had respectfully asked the frustrated nurse for permission to hold Peter, wrapping him securely in her arms, just as she used to hold her own infant siblings back in her modest neighborhood. To everyone's shock, the boy had ceased crying instantly, prompting her to pick up little Michael, who also settled down into a peaceful, quiet slumber against her chest. On her second day, when the nurse had stepped out for supplies, Rachel had strapped both boys to her body, using a traditional cloth wrap, cleaning the massive gourmet kitchen, while singing them gentle lullabies. Hearing this, Thomas felt a massive piece of the puzzle finally click into place. He offered Rachel a permanent live-in nanny position at 10 times her current salary, begging her to bring her mother and move into the 7 empty bedrooms of his home, so he would never have to face the terrifying darkness alone again. Rachel gently placed the sleeping twins into their expensive double crib, their chests rising and falling in a perfect peaceful rhythm that the massive Greenwich house had never witnessed before. Thomas stood in the doorway, feeling a warm spark of genuine hope ignite in his chest for the first time since the devastating ordeal with his children had begun. However, as he turned his gaze toward the grand hallway, he caught the unmistakable movement of a dark shadow, sliding quickly past the heavy velvet curtains of the second-floor window. A sudden icy chill raced down his spine, a primal instinct warning him that someone had been silently watching his emotional vulnerability in the garden, and this unseen observer was furious. Shaking his head to dispel the creeping paranoia, Thomas tried to convince himself it was merely a trick of the fading afternoon light, or perhaps a member of the catering staff. He walked briskly back down the grand sweeping staircase and entered his mahogany-paneled home office, intending to call the private hospital facility to share the miraculous news with Sarah. He picked up his mobile phone from the heavy leather desk, but his brow furrowed in deep confusion when the glowing screen displayed 3 missed calls from an entirely unknown caller. Pressing the return button, he held the device to his ear, but the line connected to pure, heavy silence, accompanied only by the faint sound of someone breathing deliberately on the other end. Thomas demanded to know who was calling his voice, adopting the authoritative, hardened tone he usually reserved for hostile corporate boardroom negotiations, but the mysterious caller simply terminated the connection. Staring at the darkened screen, he was just about to dismiss it as a random prank when a text message suddenly illuminated the device, causing the blood in his veins to run ice-cold. The short, sinister message stated clearly that he should never have hired the new girl, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the watcher in the window was very real. Thomas frantically typed a demand for the sender's identity, but the screen quickly flashed an error notification indicating that the cowardly number had already been permanently disconnected and blocked. Pacing across the Persian rug of his grand office, Thomas looked out the large bay windows toward the sprawling backyard, where Rachel was now quietly tidying up the discarded toys. He realized with terrifying clarity that someone inside his world was actively monitoring his decisions, and worse, they possessed a malicious agenda explicitly aimed at removing Rachel from his property. Grabbing his phone once more, he bypassed his personal contacts and directly dialed George, the highly trained head of security who managed the protective details for Thomas's various corporate enterprises. George answered on the very first ring with his signature gravelly voice, instantly detecting the severe tension radiating through his wealthy employer's strained breathing over the cellular connection. Without offering any unnecessary explanations, Thomas ordered George to come to the estate immediately, firmly demanding the installation of high-definition surveillance cameras across every single inch of the vast property. He specified that he wanted coverage on all main entrances, the servant quarters, the extensive gardens, the sprawling garage, and every single ground-floor window before the sun rose the next morning. George did not ask a single questioning word, simply confirming the direct orders and promising to arrive at the heavily gated compound with his elite tactical team in precisely 20 minutes. Hanging up the phone, Thomas felt a surge of fierce protective anger. He had finally found a desperate lifeline for his suffering family, and he refused to let an anonymous coward destroy it. Just as Thomas began to formulate a list of potential suspects among his sprawling staff, his phone vibrated violently against the polished wood of his expensive desk with another incoming message. Opening the text with trembling fingers, he read the poisonous words claiming that Rachel was entirely deceiving him and harboring a deeply disturbing hidden past that he needed to uncover. The anonymous sender cruelly challenged Thomas to ask his beloved new nanny about the dead child she had allegedly lost, throwing a massive wrench of terrifying doubt into Thomas's fragile newfound peace. His stomach plummeted, violently twisting into agonizing knots as he desperately tried to reconcile the image of the gentle singing caretaker in the garden with this horrifying, unexpected accusation. Driven by a desperate need for the absolute truth, Thomas abandoned his office and marched straight through the massive gourmet kitchen, pushing open the heavy glass doors leading to the back patio. Rachel looked up from folding the small blankets, offering a polite, deferential smile that momentarily faltered when she registered the dark, stormy expression brewing intensely on her employer's face. He stepped down the stone stairs, his eyes critically analyzing every single micro-expression on her face, searching for any subtle hint of the grand deception the anonymous messenger had promised. Controlling his rapidly fracturing emotions, he requested a private conversation, his voice dropping an octave as he gently took the small slumbering babies from her arms to hold them himself. Standing under the fading evening sky with his precious sons resting securely against his broad chest, Thomas took a ragged breath and confronted the terrified woman standing before him. He reminded her of their previous conversation, where she had firmly claimed to have no children of her own, to which Rachel nodded quickly, her brow furrowing in genuine, innocent confusion. Pulling his phone from his tailored pocket, Thomas turned the bright screen toward her, forcing her to read the cruel, anonymous message regarding the devastating loss of her secret child. All the color instantly drained from Rachel's face. Her eyes widened in absolute horror, and she stumbled backward as if she had just been physically struck by an invisible, brutal blow. Rachel covered her trembling mouth with both hands, a choked, agonizing sob tearing forcefully from her throat as the carefully constructed walls around her deepest personal tragedy violently crumbled. Staring at the manicured grass, she remained silent for a painfully long moment before finally lifting her tear-streaked face to meet Thomas's intense gaze, her voice shattered and impossibly quiet. She confessed that 12 years ago, she had indeed given birth to a beautiful baby boy who arrived far too prematurely, living for only 3 fleeting days before passing away. The overwhelming grief had absolutely broken her spirit, forcing her to bury the memory deep inside her heart, because speaking about the horrific loss to anyone simply caused too much paralyzing agony. Thomas felt the perfectly solid ground vanish entirely beneath his expensive leather shoes, a crushing wave of immense guilt washing over him for daring to suspect this remarkably resilient woman of malicious deception. He stood there holding his healthy, breathing children, looking at the devastated housekeeper who had selflessly poured all her unspent maternal love into healing his utterly broken and miserable family. He asked softly why she had kept such a monumental tragedy completely hidden, to which she tearfully explained that society rarely asked the working class about their emotional scars, and she simply preferred silence. It suddenly became radiantly clear to Thomas that her magical ability to soothe his children was born entirely from her profound understanding of what it meant to brutally lose someone you love. Filled with a righteous, burning fury directed at the cowardly stalker, Thomas firmly promised Rachel that he would relentlessly hunt down the malicious individual who had weaponized her deepest trauma. Recognizing the escalating tension, Rachel nervously wiped her eyes and bravely offered to resign her newly acquired position, fearing her complicated past would only bring more dangerous drama to his fragile household. Thomas shook his head with absolute conviction, flatly refusing her resignation and fiercely declaring that whoever was attempting to run her off the property would have to deal directly with his wrath. He commanded her to stay right where she was, assuring her that she was securely under his strict protection, and that nobody would ever threaten her livelihood or emotional peace again. Carrying the blissfully unaware twins back up the grand staircase, Thomas was acutely aware of how loudly the wooden floorboards creaked in the oppressive, haunting silence of the massive Connecticut mansion. He gently pushed open the heavy nursery door, crossing the room to lay the boys down in the lavishly decorated double crib that had until today served only as a theater for their endless misery. Arranging their soft velvet blankets, he stood vigil over them for several long minutes, struck by the profound realization that all his vast wealth could never purchase the genuine instinctual affection Rachel freely gave. Backing out of the beautifully painted room, he pulled the heavy door shut, finally recognizing that he needed to fiercely defend his home from whatever venomous snake was currently hiding in the tall grass. Retreating to his private study, Thomas locked the heavy oak door behind him and immediately booted up his high-powered computer, his mind racing through the logical possibilities of the stalker's identity. He reasoned that whoever possessed such deeply buried intimate knowledge of Rachel's tragic medical history either had substantial financial resources to hire private investigators or was someone extremely close to her inner circle. He meticulously wrote down every single unknown phone number from his call log, compiling a detailed digital dossier to send securely to George, demanding an immediate and thoroughly aggressive background trace. Thomas leaned back in his leather chair, staring blankly at the ornate ceiling, obsessively replaying the fleeting image of the dark shadow moving quickly behind the second-floor window curtains. His racing thoughts inevitably drifted toward his estranged, highly critical mother-in-law, Alice, who had vehemently opposed every single parenting decision Thomas had made since Sarah's tragic departure to the psychiatric clinic. Knowing her deep pockets and her ruthless tendency to control situations from the shadows, Thomas picked up his phone and dialed her private number, mentally preparing himself for a terribly bitter confrontation. Alice answered on the fourth ring, her voice dripping with extreme annoyance as she complained about the late hour, demanding to know why Thomas was aggressively bothering her evening routine. Taking a steadying breath, Thomas bluntly accused her of hiring a shady private investigator to maliciously dig up dirt on the new nanny, who was finally bringing peace to her suffering grandsons. A heavy, incredibly tense silence stretched across the cellular connection before Alice finally let out a short, cynical laugh, vehemently denying any involvement in such a profoundly petty and dramatic scheme. She defensively claimed she possessed far too many important social obligations to waste her valuable time policing the low-level domestic staff Thomas chose to employ in his deeply troubled household. However, Thomas could distinctly hear the subtle tremor of anxiety in her aristocratic voice, an undeniable tell that indicated she was definitely hiding crucial information even if she was not the actual stalker. Terminating the frustrating call without a proper goodbye, Thomas tightly gripped the edge of his desk, entirely convinced that the walls of his elite social circle were rapidly closing in around him. Just as the grandfather clock struck the late hour, George's name illuminated the phone screen with a highly urgent text message containing the preliminary results of the intense digital investigation. George confirmed that one of the malicious numbers was an untraceable prepaid burner phone, but the second number was miraculously registered to a shadowy private investigation firm operating right out of downtown Manhattan. Surging with a powerful wave of vindication, Thomas quickly typed back a ruthless command ordering George to absolutely spare no financial expense in discovering exactly who had paid that specific agency. Securing the phone in his pocket, Thomas left the office to check on the boys again, entirely unaware that the nightmare invading his home was about to escalate far beyond simple digital threats. Walking purposefully down the dimly lit second-floor corridor, Thomas felt his heart skip a dangerous beat when he noticed the heavy wooden door to the primary guest bedroom was inexplicably standing ajar. He possessed an absolute chilling certainty that he had personally secured that specific room earlier in the morning, making the thin slice of darkness spilling into the hallway a blaring alarm. Pushing the door open with extreme caution, he scanned the pristine, unoccupied room, immediately noticing that the large bay window had been forcefully unlatched, allowing the cool evening breeze to violently whip the expensive curtains. Moving stealthily toward the center of the room, his eyes locked onto a small, terrifyingly out-of-place object, resting perfectly in the center of the flawlessly made king-sized, luxurious mattress. It was a physical photograph, clearly aged and slightly faded, displaying a much younger Rachel, beaming with profound, innocent joy, while cradling a tiny infant wrapped tightly in a pale blue hospital blanket. Thomas felt the blood drain entirely from his face as he reached out with trembling fingers to pick up the invasive image, slowly flipping it over to reveal the disturbing contents on the back. Written in highly stylized, obsessively neat cursive handwriting was a sickeningly cruel message stating that Rachel had lost her own precious child and was now actively plotting to steal Thomas's precious sons. He squeezed the thick photo paper so tightly his knuckles turned completely white, his brain fiercely battling the sudden overwhelming wave of dark suspicion that the malicious intruder was desperately trying to plant. Paralyzed beside the grand bed, Thomas stared at the fluttering curtains and the open window, the terrifying reality of the massive security breach completely shattering his illusion of living in a safe, impenetrable fortress. He finally understood that his sprawling Greenwich estate was incredibly vulnerable, and that any small distraction or failure in judgment tonight could easily result in an irreversible, catastrophic tragedy for his vulnerable family. Stuffing the cruel photograph deep into his tailored pocket, he practically sprinted down the grand staircase, driven by a primal, desperate need to locate Rachel and hear her undeniably honest voice ground him in reality. He needed to look directly into her eyes and find the unwavering truth, knowing that a single lie right now would completely destroy the delicate healing foundation they had built today. He frantically searched the massive living room, the formal dining area, and the stainless steel kitchen, finding only empty space before pushing through the back doors into the expansive, shadowy gardens. The yard was totally deserted, carrying only the faint, lingering scent of cheap bubble solution and freshly cut grass, making the beautiful scenery feel bizarrely sinister amidst the raging war inside his troubled mind. Spotting her modest, beat-up car still parked neatly in the circular driveway, he realized she was definitely still inside the house, prompting him to rush back up the stairs with desperately quiet, controlled steps. He pushed open the heavy nursery door to find Rachel sitting completely exhausted on the thick carpet, her back against the wall, her eyes tightly closed, as she vigilantly guarded the peacefully sleeping children. Startled by the sudden intrusion, Rachel scrambled to her feet, nervously wiping her hands on her uniform in a gesture that Thomas now clearly recognized as deep-seated fear rather than just a polite habit. She quickly stammered an apology, assuring him she was merely checking on the boys, but Thomas raised a gentle hand to stop her, asking softly if she was truly doing okay, under the immense pressure. Bewildered by the rare display of genuine concern from an employer, she cautiously nodded, yes, waiting anxiously as Thomas quietly closed the heavy nursery door, sealing them together in the softly lit room. Taking a deep, steadying breath, he carefully pulled the hidden photograph from his pocket, preparing to ask the incredibly painful questions necessary to definitively clear the toxic poison from his home. Keeping his voice remarkably calm to avoid sounding like a brutal interrogation, Thomas gently asked Rachel about the terrible aftermath of her child's death, inquiring if she had received proper emotional and financial support. Rachel physically stiffened, her eyes dropping to the floor, as she explained that while her mother and siblings had provided endless love, she had never truly forgotten the pain, simply learning to survive it. Thomas hesitated, his heart breaking, before gently asking if she had ever subconsciously tried to fill that massive aching void by overly attaching herself to the vulnerable children she was paid to look after. Rachel took a sharp step backward, her eyes welling with terrified tears, as she accurately realized Thomas was questioning if she harbored a secret, unhealthy obsession with taking over his deeply fractured family. Hastily shaking his head to dispel her mounting terror, Thomas firmly clarified that those dark thoughts were not his own, finally extending his hand to reveal the horrific photograph the intruder had left on the bed. Rachel took the image as delicately as if it were a fragile pane of glass, staring at the face of her lost baby, before turning it over to read the venomous handwritten accusation. Her knees buckled slightly, the photograph slipping from her completely numb fingers to land softly on the carpet as she turned her back to Thomas, her shoulders shaking violently with devastating silent sobs. She demanded to know where he had found such an intimate, deeply painful relic. And Thomas calmly explained the terrifying breach in the guest bedroom, explicitly highlighting the malicious intent of the unknown intruder. Turning back to face him, her face soaked in tears, but her posture radiating an unbreakable, fierce dignity, Rachel swore that her only intention was to stop the endless suffering of two innocent little boys. She passionately declared that she absolutely did not want to steal his children or usurp anyone's rightful place, vehemently stating that she simply possessed the maternal knowledge to comfort them when nobody else could. Seeing the raw, unvarnished truth blazing brightly in her tear-filled eyes, Thomas stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her shaking shoulders, pulling her into a deeply comforting, fiercely protective embrace. He sincerely apologized for allowing the stalker's poison to infect his mind even for a fleeting second, vowing that tonight they would lock down the massive estate and finally launch a devastating counterattack. Late into the dark night, George arrived back at the sprawling estate, stepping through the massive front doors with the intensely focused, hyper-alert posture of a seasoned military veteran entering an active combat zone. Thomas immediately led the massive security expert up the grand staircase and straight into the breached guest bedroom, pointing out the forcefully opened bay window and detailing exactly where he had discovered the malicious photograph. George meticulously inspected the heavy wooden sill and the disturbed flower beds in the garden directly below, swiftly concluding that this was an incredibly calculated, deeply targeted intrusion rather than a random opportunistic neighborhood burglary. Frustrated by the lack of immediate digital evidence, George sharply questioned the status of the new camera system, prompting Thomas to admit the installation crew was only scheduled to arrive the following morning. Without wasting a single breath on reprimands, George immediately dispatched two heavily armed security contractors to physically patrol the expansive perimeter, assuring Thomas that a temporary mobile surveillance net would be operational within the hour. Thomas nodded grimly, his jaw set in stone, before forcefully reminding George that uncovering the true identity of the person who hired the Manhattan private investigator was the absolute highest priority on their list. George locked his eyes with his wealthy employer, confirming that he was actively cross-referencing the burner numbers with known local agency registries, promising a definitive breakthrough regarding the stalker's origin by the time the sun rose. Leaving George to fortify the compromised mansion, Thomas walked silently back toward the nursery, desperate to ensure that the delicate peace Rachel had miraculously cultivated remained completely undisturbed by the swirling chaos outside. Inside the softly glowing nursery, Rachel was sitting upright in a comfortable rocking chair, her face still heavily puffy from crying, but her entire body completely rigidly focused on the gentle breathing of the twins. As little Peter shifted restlessly under his soft blanket, Rachel immediately leaned forward, gently patting his tiny back with a perfectly measured, deeply soothing rhythm that required absolutely no frantic energy or rising panic. Thomas stood quietly in the doorway, observing the incredibly simple, profound beauty of her natural competence, completely realizing that this exact grounded stability was the elusive treasure he had desperately tried to purchase for months. He whispered softly into the quiet room, instructing Rachel to alert him at the slightest unusual noise, firmly declaring that absolutely nobody in the massive house would be sleeping alone or unprotected tonight. Retreating to his private primary suite, Thomas collapsed onto the massive, incredibly soft bed, but a million racing thoughts completely prevented any possibility of restful sleep from taking over his completely exhausted mind. He stared intensely at the intricately molded ceiling, his brain aggressively connecting the horrific hospital visits, the endless screaming of the infants, the crushing guilt of his failures, and the sudden violent terror campaign. Rising from the mattress in sheer frustration, he marched back to his office, frantically digging through the thick stacks of employment contracts, termination papers, and staff rotas, desperately searching for any logical, malicious suspect. Suddenly, his racing mind snagged on a crucial, highly volatile memory. Jessica, the incredibly bitter, intensely lazy private nurse he had furiously fired just 2 weeks prior for blatantly ignoring his screaming children. Thomas vividly recalled the cold, apathetic look in Jessica's eyes as she casually scrolled through her mobile phone, while little Michael choked on his tears and the explosive screaming match that had immediately followed. He remembered exactly how she had violently slammed the heavy front doors on her way out, screaming a vicious string of ugly curses and promising Thomas that he would deeply regret publicly humiliating her. Grabbing his phone from the desk, Thomas quickly typed a demanding message to George, providing Jessica's full legal name and ordering a comprehensive, aggressive background check on the newly suspected former employee. George replied almost instantly with a short confirmation, promising to dig up every single piece of digital dirt available on the disgruntled nurse, while simultaneously holding the defensive line outside the massive shadowed estate. Hours later, right in the absolute dead of the freezing night, Thomas's hyper-vigilant ears caught a remarkably faint, metallic scraping sound, echoing softly from the grand living room situated on the ground floor. It was not the loud crash of a clumsy burglar breaking glass, but the terrifyingly quiet, deliberate sound of someone highly familiar with the complicated layout, attempting to silently manipulate the heavy French doors. Heart violently pounding against his ribcage, Thomas crept quietly out of his office, descending the sweeping wooden staircase with extreme caution to avoid making a single sound that might alert the creeping intruder. Peering around the massive marble pillar, he spotted a dark figure wearing a heavy hooded sweatshirt, holding a small digital camera directly toward the hallway leading to the brightly lit, vulnerable nursery. Flicking on the massive crystal chandelier with a loud, aggressive smack of the wall switch, Thomas shouted furiously, commanding the stunned intruder to completely freeze right where they stood on the expensive Persian rug. Panic visibly exploded through the intruder's body. She instantly dropped the expensive digital camera onto the hard floor and bolted frantically toward the open back doors leading out into the dark, expansive garden. Thomas chased her fiercely through the manicured hedges, watching as she scrambled desperately up the high stone boundary wall, turning her head just enough for the harsh security lights to illuminate her terrified face. In that single fleeting second, Thomas clearly recognized the distinct star-shaped earring and the angry, desperate eyes of Jessica, the fired nurse, right before she vanished completely into the deep shadows of the affluent neighborhood. George and his security team converged on the garden mere seconds later, finding Thomas standing completely still by the wall, breathing heavily, while pointing firmly in the exact direction the terrified woman had fled. George quickly retrieved the abandoned digital camera from the living room floor, placing it carefully into a clear evidence bag, knowing the internal memory card would absolutely provide the undeniable proof they needed. Thomas ordered George to secure the perimeter completely and prepare all the collected evidence, firmly declaring that he was officially calling the local police department first thing in the morning to end the nightmare. Walking back upstairs, Thomas found Rachel completely terrified, but he looked her firmly in the eyes and promised that the malicious threat had a confirmed name, and by tomorrow it would be entirely neutralized. When the golden morning sun finally broke over the expansive Greenwich estate, George walked into the grand kitchen holding a thick manila folder containing the absolute undeniable proof they desperately needed to take legal action. The security expert confirmed that the incredibly shady private investigation firm had been directly hired and handsomely paid by Jessica using a completely traceable bank account connected to her personal home address. Furthermore, George had successfully pulled crystal-clear street surveillance footage, placing Jessica directly outside the estate's heavy iron gates exactly during the time the malicious photograph was planted in the upstairs guest bedroom. Thomas felt a massive, deeply profound wave of relief wash over his completely exhausted body. The terrifying mystery was officially solved, and the sinister boogeyman was simply a deeply bitter, entirely predictable former employee. Refusing to handle the dangerous situation quietly or sweep the terrifying harassment under the rug, Thomas immediately contacted Detective William at the local police precinct, demanding a full aggressive legal response to the stalking. When the police eventually arrived at the grand estate, Thomas calmly handed over the threatening text messages, the cruel photograph, the abandoned digital camera, and George's incredibly thorough, meticulously compiled security dossier. Later that afternoon, Detective William called to officially confirm that they had successfully apprehended Jessica at her remarkably messy apartment, formally charging her with breaking and entering severe harassment and malicious stalking. Thomas did not celebrate the victory with champagne or loud cheers. He simply closed his eyes and breathed deeply, profoundly, grateful that the toxic cloud hovering over his fragile family had finally dissipated. Stepping out into the warm, sunlit garden later that afternoon, Thomas found Rachel sitting comfortably on the soft grass with the deeply content twins, the scene beautifully mirroring the exact moment he had first found them. The baby boys were laughing joyfully at the floating soap bubbles, totally oblivious to the intense, dangerous drama that had raged violently in the dark shadows of their massive home just hours before. Thomas stopped a few yards away, simply observing the incredibly beautiful, ordinary magic of their peaceful interaction, realizing that Rachel had stubbornly protected their delicate innocence through the absolute darkest, most terrifying moments. Looking up and catching his eye, Rachel offered a cautious, genuinely hopeful smile, asking very softly if the terrible ordeal was finally over, and if they were truly safe to breathe again. Thomas embraced Peter and Michael, admitting to Rachel that he had wasted months searching for expensive solutions, instead of understanding that healing came through love, presence, and compassion. He promised to protect her from anyone who questioned her character, elevated her role from employee to an essential member of the family, and committed himself to becoming an actively involved father rather than hiding behind work. During an emotional video call, he reassured Sarah that their sons were thriving and urged her to let go of her guilt, while also welcoming Rachel's mother into the household and realizing that genuine relationships, not material possessions, were what his family truly needed. As the boys began sleeping peacefully and flourishing under consistent care, Thomas transformed both his priorities and the estate itself, redesigning the nursery into a warm, comforting environment based on Rachel's wisdom and destroying a photograph that had once been used to manipulate her, determined to protect her dignity and listen to her painful past only when she was ready. When Sarah returned for a joyful weekend visit, she tearfully thanked Rachel for preserving the happiness and emotional well-being of her children during the darkest chapter of their lives. Witnessing the respect shared between the two women lifted the final burden from Thomas's heart, and as the family gathered peacefully in the garden at sunset, he realized that the distance created by fear and arrogance had been replaced by trust, love, and unwavering devotion. The experience taught them that lasting healing cannot be bought with wealth or endless expertise, but is built through vulnerability, patience, empathy, and the quiet commitment to stand beside those who need us most. By valuing human dignity, rejecting manipulation and cruelty, and choosing steady presence over panic, they transformed a lonely mansion into a true sanctuary where broken hearts could finally recover and lasting peace could take root.